Hello, this is Brian Powers, and I'm a librarian at the main library in Cincinnati, Ohio. In 2017, the Cincinnati and Hamilton County Public Library was one of the sponsors of a lecture series that explored the rich heritage of bluegrass music from Southwestern Ohio, an area that covers the cities of Cincinnati, Dayton, Middletown, and Hamilton. The main library also hosted a traveling exhibit in the summer of 2017 that explored the history of bluegrass music from the region. And I'm happy to say, two projects that came out of those 2017 events, a book and a music CD, are now available in 2021. Both items share the title Industrial Strength Bluegrass, Southwestern Ohio's Musical Legacy. And today, I have the two gentlemen who are the driving force behind each of these projects. Both are longtime musicians and broadcasters in bluegrass music. We're going to be discussing some of the subjects covered in the book, listen to some music from the CD, and also talk about some of the musicians who come from the region. Fred Bartenstein, radio host, musician, festival MC, talent director, and lifelong bluegrass fan, is the co-author of the book. Joe Mullins, longtime musician, broadcaster, and record producer, oversaw the music CD. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hi, Brian.
Hey, it's great to be with you.
I thank you very much for doing this. Very excited about this book and the CD. And I was hoping that both of you, before we get into those two things, give me a little bit of background. How did you guys both get into bluegrass music?
Well, my dad was in a mandolin guitar duet in Virginia in the late 20s and early 30s. And he later became a business executive and moved to the New York area. But he had a guitar, and when we would go home to Virginia, every Christmas, every summer, I would hear bluegrass on the radio. That's so long ago, it wasn't even called bluegrass yet. I remember it was called mountain music. This would have been around 1956. And a couple years after that, the word bluegrass came into wider use. And I was a born-again bluegrass fan. There's no question about that.
How about you, Joe?
Same thing. My dad was a lifelong broadcaster and fiddle player as well. And I grew up surrounded by all the great first generation bluegrass recordings. Most of the founding fathers of bluegrass music were family friends. And my dad worked in a big variety of bands, produced concerts, was a recording artist. So I've been saturated with all things bluegrass since I was born in Middletown, Ohio, 55 years ago.
So you guys are both based in Southwest Ohio. I think, Fred, you're in Yellow Springs. And Joe, you grew up in Middletown.
I grew up in Middletown. I live near Fred now. I've owned a network of radio stations. That's our main studio is in Xenia. So Fred and I are pretty much neighbors.
So how would you guys describe music out of the Southwestern Ohio? How's it different from, say, other kind of bluegrass music?
Joe, you want to start on that?
Well, I've heard it said before, and I've used the quote myself many times in putting together the facts for this project and producing the music for this album. Nobody makes better music than homesick hillbillies. And the entire story, as Fred and Kurt Ellison from Mime University can tell you, it starts, if you go back anywhere from 60 to 80 years with the Appalachian migration. All those families that left the hills and hollers of Kentucky and West Virginia and East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia that sought economic growth at the factories in Ohio. When they left those mountains, it changed their whole life. And that lifestyle was lamented in songs, whether they were in taverns or in churches, wherever it happened, front porches, kitchen tables. The mountain music out of Appalachian poverty found a home in Southwestern Ohio. And they played and sang like their lives depended upon it. And that type of intensity, it rang up and down the streets of Dayton and Middletown and Hamilton and Springfield and Cincinnati the whole time I was growing up. And my dad was a big part of that whole scene. And so It was named Industrial Strength by Dr. Neil V. Rosenberg, who literally wrote the book on bluegrass. He's one of the foremost scholars and member of the Bluegrass Hall of Fame. And Fred, I'll let Fred pick up because Neil came to Dayton for a big bluegrass celebration in the 80s. And that was kind of the catalyst of where we are now, right, Fred?
Yeah, a lot of people think of bluegrass music as being something from the South and from the mountains. The reality is that bluegrass came of age north in the industrial areas like Dayton, Cincinnati, Baltimore, Washington, Detroit, Chicago. Bill Monroe first recorded with the Bluegrass Boys in Chicago. He first performed professionally in Chicago. So when we use the term industrial strength bluegrass, strong, aggressive, when you think of a factory, it's a loud environment. And when you think of a bar in which everybody's having a good time after their factory shift, that's also a loud environment. So the bluegrass bands that came up in our area had to play over the ambient sound of their environment. So maybe a little louder, maybe a little faster, a little more aggressive than bluegrass would be elsewhere.
Well, Fred, can you tell us a little bit about, since you were sort of one of the main guys behind getting the book project going, give us a little background about how that came about.
Well, a bunch of people got together. It's probably been a decade ago, mostly in Cincinnati, that asked Joe and me to get involved with them. And what they were trying to do was preserve this important story of bluegrass in Southwestern Ohio while it could still be preserved. Starting in 1947, and the glory years went up till about 1989. So people were beginning to pass from the scene, to die, to go into nursing homes, to move away. So if we were ever going to capture this history, it had to be done now. And so around about 2017, as Brian mentioned, we went into high gear with a lecture series sponsored by Miami University and the Cincinnati Public Library, and then convinced University of Illinois Press to publish the book and convinced Smithsonian Folkways Records in Washington to produce the CD.
Well, how did you go about deciding what the book should cover? It's a series of essays and chapters, and how did you go about deciding who you thought we should focus on different subjects?
Well, I had edited several books about bluegrass, and I knew it would be a huge project for one person to research and write all of this. I knew that Kurt Ellison had written a book about country music. He had recently retired from Miami University, and I approached him asking him to write this book. I told him I would do all of the research and the groundwork for him, and he said in a heartbeat, "No, I'm not going to write it, but how about this idea? We do a series of lectures, and one of the requirements of each lecture would be that they turn in a publishable chapter." And that sounded like it would be easy. In retrospect, I think it would have been easier to just write the doggone thing. But we were able to find really knowledgeable, competent, capable people to write about the different aspects of bluegrass in our region, the recording studios, the radio broadcasts, the religious bluegrass scene, the migration itself. And we had about 10 people that eventually got involved in this and contributed chapters.
That's great. And Joe, you led the project on the CD. Can you give us some background about that project?
Yeah, well, I too was part of the think tank gathered by Miami along with you and several other bluegrass enthusiasts and scholars and historians. And I was really delighted when I found out that Fred and Kurt would be able to get the book published. And I thought, well, we need a new representation of the music that we're talking about. When I say a new representation, wanted to find the best current bluegrass and roots music recording artist to record new versions of some of the songs that directly connect to Southwestern Ohio's musical legacy. Songs that were either first written or performed or recorded by bands that were in the area, songs that came out of the recording studios or the churches of this region. And I really was blessed to have some of the top artists that I respect and who really have the eyes and ears of the roots music public to get excited about it. Called Dan Tominski, and I said, a Jimmy Martin song needs to be on this record. Jimmy and Bobby Osborne partnered as young men in 1951 and recorded the first Bluegrass at King Records in Cincinnati. After Bobby returned from the Marine Corps, Jimmy and Bobby and Sonny Osborne signed with RCA Records. And I called Dan Tominski and I said, I'd like to hear you sing 2020 Vision. And he said, I've been wanting to sing that song all my life. And that was the kind of reception I got. I called Bluegrass Hall of Fame member Doyle Lawson. I said, we want 2 or 3 gospel tracks on this album. And Doyle has covered a few of the Browns Ferry 4 gospel classics through the years as he grew up hearing that music in East Tennessee from WLW in Cincinnati. And he said, I've got a perfect Browns Ferry 4 song I've always wanted to record. So it's now near the top of the charts on Bluegrass Gospel Radio. And the list goes on and on. So we wanted to represent the music that we've written about in the book on a recorded project. And CD and download are available worldwide. And it just came out the last week of March.
And it's put up by Smithsonian Folkways?
Yes, Smithsonian. I chose to approach them about it because one of the main missions of Folkways Records, and now that Smithsonian adopted that label years ago, acquired all their catalog of music, is everything in that record label stays available in perpetuity. Whatever device people are listening to music on in 100 years, they'll be able to hear this recording. And they also allowed a detailed set of liner notes. My son Daniel helped me choose some of the material and helped me brainstorm on putting the right songs with the right artist. And he did the extensive research on each song and wrote a detailed series of liner notes that are also available inside the compact disc project or online with the download. So that was the place to put it. I wanted people not just inside bluegrass music. I'm blessed to be connected to many of the bluegrass only record labels, but I wanted the whole world to have a chance to hear this over the next few decades, and I think they will.
And your son Daniel, he also wrote a chapter for the book.
Yeah, 3rd generation broadcaster. He works with me at the radio network that we manage called Real Roots Radio. We have AM and FM coverage throughout 3 counties in southwestern Ohio. It winds up touching about a dozen counties, but Daniel, he'll be 30 years old later this summer. He has a great passion for all things roots music. But when you talk about the music he grew up hearing me and his grandfather constantly playing and promoting, he likes the challenge of having today's audiences pay attention to yesterday's music that was made here in the Miami Valley. So he helped, and he wrote the chapter in the book on radio and television broadcasting. And my dad had a big part in that for many, many years on the radio station in Middletown, Ohio. Mm-hmm. But that station had a history going back to 1947. Fred threw that year out a minute ago. And those first years following World War II saw thousands of families every year migrating from Appalachia to the Miami Valley. And the radio station in Middletown went on the air in 1947 and immediately started serving that population. So Daniel dug into all the details, not only on that station, but on the hillbilly music first heard on WLW in the 1930s, mm-hmm. And seen on television in the Cincinnati and Dayton area through other local sources back in the 40s and 50s. So it's a family project. There's 3 generations mm-hmm. of us that have help make music and promote music in the Miami Valley.
That's great. Fred, can you tell some other people who contributed to the book? Who were some of the other writers?
Sure. Let me turn to the table of contents as my cheat sheet here. Neil Rosenberg, who had written a history of bluegrass music, wrote the foreword, and then Phil Obermiller, who is a known Cincinnati area historian of urban Appalachian phenomena, wrote the chapter on the migration. Joe Mullins interviewed Bobby Osborne, and we printed that story of how Bobby started in bluegrass. Joe's mentioned his son Daniel wrote about broadcasting. A very, very knowledgeable record collector in our area, Mac McDivitt, wrote about recording studios, record labels, and record stores. I wrote the history of sacred bluegrass music, which is a whole world into itself. You know, hundreds of bands and churches and a gospel music circuit. Lily Isaacs, who was part of that circuit, wrote her own personal reminiscences of starting the world-renowned gospel band, the Isaacs, here in our Miami Valley area. John Hartley Fox, who had written a book about King Records, wrote about bluegrass in the 70s, which is notable because that's when non-Appalachian people first started to get seriously interested in bluegrass. Rick Good, who was a member of the Hot Mud family, and Rhythm and Shoes, wrote about the Living Arts Center in Dayton. Nathan McGee from Cincinnati wrote about bluegrass music and urban Appalachian identity in Cincinnati. And finally, a well-known musicologist and musician, Ben Krakauer from Warren Wilson College in North Carolina, wrote about how the music in our region was different from music elsewhere in the bluegrass world.
Yeah, it's a great book. It's and it reads really well too. You know, I like how it's broken down by the chapters and things. And I particularly enjoyed all the record labels. That's kind of like one of my interests and stuff. And that's one of the things I kind of wanted to talk about. But we'll get to that in a second. But I kind of thought we'd listen to some of the music from the CD and talk about some of the themes that also are in the book. You know, because it kind of both the book and the music CD overlap, you know. So I thought we would we'll talk about some certain songs, why you picked them, and how they kind of relate to the whole history. So Joe, the first song on the whole CD is a Dwight Yoakam song. Can you tell us about that song, why you chose that song?
Well, I can. Dwight didn't grow up in Cincinnati or Dayton. He was born in eastern Kentucky, but his family migrated north on US 23. They wound up in Columbus. There are tens of thousands of Southwestern Ohioans, though, who may have came north on US 23 and then took 52 to Cincinnati, or 73 to Middletown, or 35 to Dayton. Or many traveled old US 25, the Dixie Highway, to escape the poverty of eastern Kentucky and land good jobs in Southwestern Ohio. The song sets the stage for the album. The album is somewhat thematic, the way all the songs connect together. And the migration was the first piece to put bluegrass music into our metropolitan area. So I wanted to sing a song about it. And it's very personal to me because my mother's family was from not too far off US Route 23 in Lawrence County, Kentucky. And when my mom and dad migrated to Kentucky, they came north on US 23, took State Route 73 across southern Ohio right into Middletown, where I grew up. And as the second verse in the song explains, those Appalachian families, they had to put all the kids in the car on Friday night and go back to Kentucky. And my parents were that way. They called eastern Kentucky home, even after we'd lived in Middletown for 25 years. If we had a weekend without any obligations, let's go home for the weekend, my mom would say, and we'd take off right back down to US 23 South into eastern Kentucky to see my grandparents. So the song's very personal. It sets the stage for the entire album. Dwight Yoakam's composition and the Radio Ramblers version of Reading, Writing, and Route 23.
They learn reading, writing, Route 23, to the jobs that lay waiting in those cities' factories. They learned reading, writing, roads to the north, to the luxury and comfort a coal miner can't afford. They thought reading, writing, Route 23 would take them to the good life they had never seen. They didn't know that old highway could lead them to a world of misery.
Yeah, and migration is a big part of the book too. I mean, that it really gets in. It tells. It kind of explains a lot about why bluegrass is so big here in Cincinnati, or
Exactly.
the greater Cincinnati area. But you guys might say the greater Middletown area. I wanted to talk a little bit about some recordings that were recorded in the area, and one of the earliest ones was probably when Flatt and Scruggs recorded here in downtown Cincinnati, just a couple blocks away from the library at the Herzog Studios. Can either of you tell me a little bit about Flatt and Scruggs recording at Herzog, and what was songs, and why you picked a certain song for the album to represent that history?
Well, Flatt and Scruggs were a new act. They'd left Monroe's band late 1947, early 1948. I think they'd only done one recording session previously to coming to Cincinnati. Before Nashville was Music City, USA, Cincinnati had a history of being part of the music business, principally because of WLW. It was the nation's station, and there was a lot of talent there from every genre. But Bucky Herzog had built a recording studio in a building on Race Street in Cincinnati. Hank Williams had been to that recording studio in late '47, recorded his breakout hit, The Lovesick Blues. It was spring of '49, the first time Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs and their Foggy Mountain Boys came to Cincinnati to record. The first song they recorded in Cincinnati was Baby Blue Eyes. A Virginia gentleman who was quite a songwriter and crooner named Jim Eanes had worked with the Foggy Mountain Boys for a little while in their beginnings. And that's where Lester Flatt had learned the song Baby Blue Eyes. And it was the first recording for Flatt and Scruggs in Cincinnati. They were back later in '49, recorded in December, a half a dozen or more songs at the same studio. And that's when Scruggs first recorded the Foggy Mountain Breakdown. This was in '49. The song didn't gain its popularity until the late '60s as the principal piece of the soundtrack for Bonnie and Clyde. So big history connection to one of the most popular instrumentals in American music, made in Cincinnati in 1949. But Baby Blue Eyes, it hadn't been covered a lot. There weren't a lot of versions of that song. The Flatt and Scruggs catalog has been covered extensively by musicians for decades now. But I was working at the Grand Ole Opry 2 winters ago with Vince Gill, and Vince has deep roots in bluegrass music, and he's quite a crooner himself, as was Lester Flatt. And I said, Vince, we want you to record a Flatt and Scruggs song. He said, I'll record anything you want, anytime you want. I love bluegrass music, and I'm glad to be a part of it. So made for a great cut on the record.
I'll always keep the memory of you, and visions of eyes as blue as the sky. That's why each night there's tears on my pillow. I'm dreaming of you, two baby blue eyes.
I want to move on to another recording studio in Cincinnati, and that was King Records. They had a studio up near Xavier University in Evanston, and you also have covered 2 artists that were King Records artists. You did 2 of their songs of their each, and that would be the Stanley Brothers and Reno and Smiley. Can you give me a little bit about the songs that you chose about for the CD?
Yeah, there was a lot of bluegrass made at King, a lot for King Records and a lot for other record labels as well. The studio was quite popular. Reno and Smiley had came there with another early country music act in the early '50s, and Sid Nathan befriended them. And when Reno and Smiley put together a band and launched their show in the early 50s. They wound up coming to Cincinnati dozens and dozens of times. Fred knew Don Reno quite well personally, and I got to know him some in my teenage years before he passed away. But I've heard so many stories of Don Reno writing a half a dozen songs on the way from the Roanoke area in Virginia, where they were established in the late 50s and early 60s, writing songs while making the drive to Cincinnati, Ohio. And Ronnie Reno, Don's oldest son, was a part of many of their recordings in the late 50s through the Reno and Smiley partnership. And Ronnie still, while he's retired, he's a respected singer, songwriter, and businessman in the bluegrass community. And Ronnie said that King Records was such a phenomenal place. They could come in, record a whole album in one day, and leave the next day with boxes full of LPs in the trunks of their car or inside their tour bus. And he said, we literally could make a record at King and hear it on a jukebox almost anywhere within a dozen states by the following weekend. That's the kind of businessman Sid Nathan was. You want to add anything to that, Fred?
No, that really covers it. 1951 was the first time that a solid bluegrass record was made in Cincinnati. Jimmy Martin and Bob Osborne. Before Bobby Osborne went to Korea, they recorded 4 tunes. And then later, as Joe said, Reno and Smiley. And after Reno and Smiley, the Stanley Brothers. After the Stanley Brothers, Moore and Napier. Those were although there were other bluegrass acts on King, those were the superstars.
Yeah. Reno Smiley had an old hillbilly novelty tune that Don had helped write called Barefoot Nellie. That's a fun, energetic, up-tempo tune. And Americana music star Jim Lauderdale did a great job delivering Barefoot Nellie, along with one of the best young acts who always dig deep into the Reno and Smiley catalog or to the Jim and Jesse catalog. They play with a passion that harkens back to the 1950s. It's a band called High Fidelity. And we put High Fidelity and Jim Lauderdale together. Well, that's the first tune we recorded for the album, and it's got a ton of energy.
Nellie's got a pair of shoes and she can wear them if she chooses. So why the heck she got the blues? Who wants to wear size 22? Hey,
Barefoot Nellie,
oh,
Barefoot Nellie,
hey,
Barefoot Nellie,
you're the one for me. Hey,
Barefoot Nellie,
oh,
Barefoot Nellie,
hey,
Barefoot Nellie,
you're the one for me.
Fred, can you tell us anything about that Stanley song that's recorded for the album? Do you know much about Stone Walls and Steel Bars?
Well, that was really the last hit that the Stanley Brothers had. It actually went on jukeboxes after Carter Stanley had died in 1965. So it was, Joe, who wrote Stone Walls and Steel Bars?
It was written in Cincinnati. It was written by
Ray Pendleton.
Ray Pennington. Pennington, same guy that wrote Don't Cheat in Our Hometown, which was a Stanley Brothers recording made about the same time as Stone Walls and Steel Bars. Ricky Skaggs turned it into a #1 country song 30 years later. But Pennington was one of the engineers and producers, one of the producers at King Studios. And he wrote several songs that, in the final years of Carter Stanley's career as a recording artist, he was battling depression and alcoholism, and his songwriting had slowed down quite a bit. So when the Stanleys would hit Cincinnati and need songs to record, Ray Pennington always had a handful to pitch him, and they recorded several of his numbers. And Stone Walls and Steel Bars, another reason it's on the album, it hadn't been covered. There hasn't been a bluegrass hit version of that since the Stanley Brothers. And Ronnie Bowman and Don Rigsby and Kenny Smith are bluegrass all-stars who can deliver that kind of soul. Rigsby's from down in eastern Kentucky, and he loves singing anything that Ralph Stanley ever sang. And those guys nailed the feel of that old song, I thought.
And Brian, both Joe and I are broadcasters, and we can testify that that song recorded in 1964, 1965, in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, and the 90s, you almost couldn't do a bluegrass show on the radio without somebody calling in wanting to hear Stonewalls and Steel Bars.
Yeah.
It's one of the biggest hits in this region.
Gray-haired warden, deep Frisco Bay. Guards all around me, leading my way. Well, I had it coming at the end of the line. No more stone walls and steel bars, or you on my mind. Stone walls and steel bars, love on my mind. I'm a 3-time loser, I'm long gone this time.
And speaking of the Stanley Brothers and their hit catalog, my dad was in radio for 45 years. He started in Eastern Kentucky in 1960, January of 1960, and started developing his style of delivering bluegrass and country music on radio. And he hit his stride by the time he came to Middletown in the mid-60s. 64, he came to Middletown, was on that station for about 25 years, and then spent his last 10 years as a broadcaster on my radio network from Xenia. But in 45 years of broadcasting, Dad started on radio just a few months before the Stanley Brothers recorded Rank Strangers to Me. Rank Strangers was on King and Starday Records, and it received major distribution. In 45 years, my dad said the single most requested song on his radio programs for all those years was Rank Strangers. And you go right back to those displaced mountaineers, the people that came from the hills and hollers to a foreign land, came to the major urban and metropolitan areas in Cincinnati and Dayton. Not major by standards of Los Angeles or New York, but certainly major compared to Hazard, Kentucky, or wherever they came from down home. And Rank Strangers is about someone being alone in a foreign land. And it's an old Albert E. Brumley tune out of the hymnal from the early 40s, but the Stanley Brothers version of Rank Strangers to Me has spoken to the hearts of millions of displaced mountain people.
Well, I want to talk about broadcasting, but before I do that, I do want to mention, Ray Pendleton. We just lost him last year in 2020. And Ray, I got to interview him a few times, and he ties in with this theme exactly. He was a Kentucky boy who moved over the Rhine as a child and grew up in over the Rhine and got into music, played around town, had a country band and a rock and roll band. And then he got himself into King Records and got songs covered by Stanley Brothers and stuff like that. And that helped him get established down in Nashville later on. And he became a successful record producer and a songwriter.
Yeah. Pennington had a big part to do. I spoke with Ronnie Reno about the details of the recordings of Reno and Smiley as I was researching what we needed to contribute to the album. And he said Ray Pennington played snare drum on all of the Reno and Smiley recordings. And I wanted to mention that because we also included a legendary Cincinnati musician on a few tracks on Industrial Strength Bluegrass, the recording. And that's Phil Paul. Phil, well into his 90s.
He's 96.
96 now. Our friend Larry Nager, who's such a respected journalist, has spent a lot of time in Cincinnati and played with a lot of Cincinnati and Dayton bluegrass bands. He made friends with Phil several years ago, and we knew of Phil's fame, and knew he was still active as a musician. And he had played on a lot of records at King back in the 1950s, particularly, including one of the Stanley Brothers records. And so Phil put snare drum. He was a percussionist on at least 3 tracks on Industrial Strength Bluegrass.
Yeah, I've talked to Phil a lot over the years, and he actually was on Hawkshaw Hawkins' very last album that Ray Pendleton produced. I think it was right before the plane accident, where Hawkshaw died with Patsy Cline.
Yeah.
and with Cowboy Copus.
Yeah.
But he played on that whole album, and they actually Hawkshaw had a hit on that album. But
Yeah,
that's Philip Paul playing drums.
Yeah, I picked Phil up at his home, and he lives about 3 blocks from the old King building on Brewster Avenue in Evanston neighborhood in Cincinnati. And I took him to a studio in northern Kentucky where he did the snare drum part on 3 of the songs, including the opening track, Reading, Writing, Route 23 by the Radio Ramblers. So it was fun.
Well, I want to move on to broadcasting, which we've touched on a little bit already, but I guess my main focus would probably be about the station in Middletown. Who were some of the people, maybe Fred, you could tell because it's in the book a little bit, but some of the people that came out of that radio station, and I think they used to have a tent broadcasting and things like that. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
There were 2 glory periods in Middletown bluegrass history. The second one Joe has already mentioned, when his dad, Paul Mullins, was the king of bluegrass broadcasting from the 60s through the 80s. But earlier, WPFB in Middletown went on the air in 1947, and their brilliant strategy was to narrowcast to Appalachian people that were beginning to fill up the whole Miami Valley. And early on in the career of that radio station, they had the brainstorm of putting on a live concert every Saturday night in a tent, and then for a while it was in a barn, then the barn burned down and they moved it back into the tent. The WPFB Jamboree became the most important forge for bluegrass careers of any place on earth. That is where the Osborne brothers got their start. Red Allen got his start. Jimmy Martin, Jim and Jesse, Noah Craze, Hilo Brown. Really important musicians who started there. And not only the local musicians, but the national acts would come in and perform at the WPFB Jamboree. In the book, there's a picture of Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys standing in front of that very tent.
Well, one of the songs that's on the album that you picked, Joe, is "The Rolling Mills of Middletown." And I thought maybe we should play a little bit of that song because, well, it's about Middletown, and it's an important. You talk about Cincinnati, but you don't hear Middletown as much as But I think we should play as a little bit of tribute to, I guess, Middletown.
Yeah, well, it is. Tom T. Hall's a member of the Country Music Hall of Fame and the Bluegrass Hall of Fame. Bring his name up because he wrote the song. He came to Middletown and spent a day and a half at the request of Armco Steel, now AK Steel, back about 1971. They wanted a song about the steel mill and about how important it was to life in Ohio. Tom T., he didn't write anything that particularly glorified the American Rolling Mills Company, but he wrote a great country song that was in his same album as Old Dogs and Children and Watermelon Wine. When we talk about industrial strength, about those families that had to leave the hills and hollers to get good jobs, Armco Steel employed through the years, no doubt hundreds of thousands of Appalachians found work at Armco Steel. The recorded version in the album is by Larry Cordell, another one of the great storyteller songwriters of our time and a good singer. He was delighted to cover a song first written by one of his heroes, Tom T. Hall, and it tells about factory life for a hillbilly in Ohio, the rolling mills of Middletown.
Well, I think we should hear a little bit of that song. So let's listen to that for a little bit.
One night the foreman on his turn said, "Cool down, number 2." And he told my friend to go on home as soon as he was through. He stopped into a little bar to have a good cold beer. His woman and some day-turned guy were dancing closely there. Oh, I knew him well, and in his mind there must have been a storm. While the rolling mills of Middletown roll on, roll on, roll on.
All right. Well, that was the Rolling Mills of Middletown, and that is on a new CD put out by one of my guests, Joe Mullins, about bluegrass, the bluegrass heritage of southern Western Ohio. Another song you have on this album is called Family Reunion, which really kind of is a couple. You mentioned earlier you have a few gospel songs, but Fred, you talk about gospel music in the book. Can you give us a little bit of background about gospel music and bluegrass?
Well, bluegrass, the earliest bluegrass bands in history included about a third of their material as gospel material. Most of the bluegrass audience grew up in evangelical churches, and they knew the hymns that were in the Red Book or in the paperback hymnals. So the bluegrass bands would typically play that material. When this area started to become a bluegrass hotbed, a number of bands specialized in bluegrass gospel music. Now, some of the bands played both, some of them only played secular, and some of them only played sacred material.
Great. So, Joe, the song that you have here, Family Reunion, why that song? And tell us who you got to sing on that.
Well, Family Reunion fits the theme no matter who sings it, because those displaced Appalachians had to go back and keep their roots deep in Kentucky or Tennessee or Virginia soil. Family was everything to a lot of those folks, including my family. We still have a family reunion in Menifee County, Kentucky, where my dad was from, every year. The song was first written and recorded in the Cincinnati area. A family from Milan, Indiana, the Holt family, and the Gabbard family. They were the key components of the band, the Boys from Indiana. Now, what's Indiana got to do with it? Well, us in the greater Cincinnati tri-state area know that from Milan, Indiana to downtown Cincinnati is less than an hour. And when Aubrey Holt and his uncle, who was just a year older than him, Harley Gabbard, when they were teenagers, they were playing and singing and writing songs, and they had to gravitate to the recording studios in Cincinnati. Those two wound up cutting a wide path in bluegrass as the Boys from Indiana, along with my dad and Dayton area banjo player Noah Crace. But back to the 1950s, Aubrey Holt and Harley Gabbard wrote the song, made a record of it locally in Cincinnati. It wound up getting picked up by Carl Story, who was a nationally known bluegrass gospel recording artist, and Carl had a significant recording of the song on Mercury Records. Rhonda Vincent knew the song. She grew up singing with her family in rural Missouri. And we partnered Rhonda Vincent, the Queen of Bluegrass and the newest member of the Grand Ole Opry, with a youngster from Richmond, Indiana, who grew up hearing the Boys from Indiana, a youngster named Caleb Darty. And Caleb and Rhonda did a great job on the song. I wanted them to sing it because I wanted a male voice and a female voice to trade verses on it. And it turned out really good. Originally made in Cincinnati, and one that tugs at the heartstrings of folks who want to be back home with mom and dad.
Well, I think we should hear a little bit of it. So here is Family Reunion.
Come on to the family reunion with mother and daddy so sweet. Come on to the family reunion. It might be the last time we meet. Now mother is sick.
And that was Family Reunion from a new CD that my guest put together called Industrial Strength Bluegrass. I want to move on and talk a little bit about some of the players that came out of the region. And the first guy I want to talk to is a mandolin player who did a song called Mountain Strings. Can you guys talk a little bit about this guy?
Go ahead,
Well,
Frank.
frankly,
You knew
Yeah,
Frank.
Frank Wakefield was from Tennessee, from East Tennessee, and he moved up to Dayton when he was a teenager. And according to Red Allen, Red was driving down the street one day and saw this kid sitting on the stoop of the sidewalk playing a mandolin. And Red said, "Can you play that thing?" And Frank said, "Hey, I can play a little." And they ended up being a team, an on again, off again team. But Frank is kind of a mad genius. It would be hard to explain Frank to somebody that had never seen him or talked to him. He talks backwards, for example. I've actually played with Frank Wakefield in a band in New York City in the late 1960s. So Frank was one of the characters from this region that I knew before I actually moved here. He probably came as close as anyone to emulating Bill Monroe's style. And he went out to Bill Monroe's Bluegrass Park in Bean Blossom, Indiana in the early 1950s and showed Bill how well he could play. And Bill said, "Now you can play my style. You better get your own style." So Frank went out to the very edges. I mean, he's probably close to a jazz man, you know, Sun Ra and Music of the Spheres. And so Joe can pick up the story from here and talk about how Mountain Strings got on the album.
Thanks, Fred. Sierra Hull is a phenomenal mandolin artist and just a sweetheart of roots music these days. And Sierra was scheduled to be in the recording studio for one of the sessions. And I said, we can't let this opportunity go by. Let's get Sierra to take the lead on a track and show her instrumental prowess as one of the great artists of our time. And Sierra, Frank had a mandolin tune called New Camptown Races that she knew. Everybody's played that at some time or another. It was one of Frank's, it was his most recognizable composition. Well, we got to digging around and we found Mountain Strings, and Frank had recorded it with Red Allen in about 1961. And the mandolin is tuned into the key of D in kind of a tuning that Monroe had used in the early 50s. Frank played rock and roll. He played a rock and roll 8-bar blues boogie woogie beat on Mountain Strings. And Sierra Hull and a cast of great musicians just took it to another level. So it's Monroe, Wakefield, Sierra Hull, bluegrass, rock and roll on the song Mountain Strings.
All right, well, let's hear a little bit of that. All right. Well, great. That's Mountain Strings. And you guys had mentioned Red Allen, and he's another important guy that came out of this area. Can you guys tell me a little about him and his story?
Well, Red Allen was from about 25 miles as the crow flies, and maybe an hour if you have to go around the mountain roads from where Bobby and Sonny Osborne grew up in eastern Kentucky, a place called Pigeon Roost. And Red went in the Army when he was too young, and they found out about it, and they kicked him out of the Army, and he came back to Dayton and started to hang around in the bars playing music with anybody that could pick. And in the mid-1950s, he ran into the Osborne brothers, and they created some of the most amazing trio harmony that has ever been performed or recorded before or since. And Joe picked up one of Red Allen and the Osborne brothers songs to put on the album.
Yeah, their biggest chart record was Once More. Red Allen and the Osborne brothers were working the Wheeling Jamboree, driving back and forth every weekend from Dayton to Wheeling. And one of the cast members of the Jamboree had the song Once More, and Bobby started learning it. and they developed their classic high lead trio style driving back to Dayton one night, and went to MGM Records and made history again with a significant top 15 hit on all the country music charts. And the song was covered by the Grascals, popular Nashville, Tennessee bluegrass band, which was founded by a few former band members of the Osborne brothers. So it was a perfect combination.
See, Brian, Bobby Osborne has a super high voice. And the typical bluegrass trio is arranged where the melody is in the middle and the tenor singer sings above it and the baritone singer sings below that. So when Joe mentions high lead trio, they switch that stack around and put the highest voice, put the melody in the highest voice on top. So as people listen to Once More, listen to that high voice that Bobby Osborne puts in, both singing the verses and staying on the same melody for the choruses. They never needed a lead singer again. Bobby was both he was able to arrange his music in his style and sounded like no other band on earth.
Yeah, you talk about in the book about how he discovered sort of that singing style, didn't he?
Right. They were driving back from the Wheeling Jamboree, which is about a 3.5-hour drive from Wheeling to Dayton. And they were singing this song that they'd learned from one of the singers at Wheeling. And Red didn't feel like singing his normal part. So Bobby started singing it, and Sonny jumped in underneath, and then Red, who was not feeling too ambitious, just dropped down an octave below where the tenor would normally be. And they realized that they'd split the bluegrass atom, and apparently sang that song the whole way on the rest of the drive. They had to pull off the road at some point, get the guitar out of the trunk to figure out what key they had been singing it in, and then decided to go to Nashville to record it. When they got to Nashville, MGM Records says, we don't think the market's ready for that sound. Bluegrass has to be fast. And the Osborne brothers staked their career on recording Once More, and it turned out really well.
It was a breakthrough in their career.
Totally. Well, they'd already had one important breakthrough before that, which was a song called Ruby, Are You Mad? In which both Bobby and Sonny played banjos. They'd introduced this to the earth, the idea of playing banjos in harmony, which was their signature sound for a while, until they hit Once More and found the vocal style that made history.
So, Joe, how did you approach recording Once More?
Well, I mentioned Nashville's the Grascals. They're one of the bands that adopted the Osborne brothers' vocal style from the beginning. A great vocal group, and some of the founding members of the Grascals grew up working in the Osborne brothers band, so they knew how to get that identifiable sound. And just put some of this into context for some novice bluegrass fans that may catch our broadcast. Once More was a decade before Rocky Top. Rocky Top, one of the biggest bluegrass hits of all time, one of the most recognizable bluegrass recordings. That's also the Osborne brothers a decade later, right after they became the Grand Ole
Which
Opry.
it's not the brothers Osborne.
Right.
It's the Osborne brothers.
Exactly.
That's right. Well, let's hear that song. Let's hear the Grascals doing Once More. So here it is.
Once more to be with you, dear, just for tonight, to hold you tight. Once more, I'd give a fortune if I could see you once more.
Well, that was Once More by the Grascals, and that's on a new album called Industrial Strength Bluegrass that my guest here, Joe Mullins, has put together. And I also have Fred here, who is put together a book on bluegrass from Southwestern Ohio. I don't know why I'm having problems saying Southwestern Ohio. I've lived here for 25 years, but we're getting close to the end of our interview here, but I kind of wanted to end on Bobby Osborne. One, because he was part of the lecture series back in 2017. I wanted you guys to talk a little bit about that night when you played with you, Joe, and with your band, but also talk about this song and why you picked this song and how the song was came together.
Well, Bobby recorded "We'll Head Back to Harlan." First of all, on Bobby Osborne, he's one of the most influential people in all of bluegrass music history. His voice has been so identifiable as part of the fabric of bluegrass music since the late 1940s. He kind of started the whole thing. And the book gives the details on Bobby's family moving when he was a youngster from the coal fields of Kentucky to Dayton so his dad could take a good job at NCR. And their dad took the family to see Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys at Dayton's Memorial Hall when Bobby was about 15 years old. And a couple years later, he starts his career singing on that WPFB Jamboree in Middletown. And then we've mentioned him all throughout this whole story. So it was great to have him on the Miami Hamilton campus back in 2017 for that lecture series. We did a detailed interview on his childhood memories of Dayton and Middletown and the music that him and his brother and Jimmy Martin and Red Allen had made to really solidify the industrial strength sound here in the Miami Valley of Ohio. So at age 88 last summer, Bobby will be 90 December the 7th of 2021. So he was 88 years old. And I said, Bobby, I'd like for you to record a song for this album since you kind of started this whole industrial strength mess in the 1940s. And he said, I'd be glad to. And he was familiar with the writer of this song. I mentioned his name earlier. It was Aubrey Holt. And the song is so true. I grew up right here in the Miami Valley. I've been a broadcaster and a performer for a lifetime here. And I also travel nationwide with my band, the Radio Ramblers. And I have met through my lifetime hundreds of people who got in their 30 years at Procter & Gamble or GE or Armco Steel or Wright Pat Air Force Base who worked here in the area. And after they retired, they moved right back to the hills. Something they could not get it out of their. You can take a boy out of the country, but you can't take the country out of a boy. And this song speaks to that. Those thousands of Appalachian families who found a better life that they were looking for to raise kids and put kids through college and pay for a home here in Southwestern Ohio. But they wanted to move back to mom and dad's little mountain farm or go back down to the hills somewhere. And that's what the song's all about. It really brings the industrial strength story full circle from the migration all the way back to retirement out of the factory so they could go back to the hills. Bobby Osborne sings, We'll Head Back to Harlan and Daddy's Old Farm.
Mama, pack your suitcase, we're leaving tomorrow. I'll draw my last pay and I'll gas up the car. My working day's over, it's time to go home now. We'll head back to Harlan and Daddy's old farm. We'll head back to Harlan and Daddy's old farm.
Well, it's a fantastic CD, and the book is awesome too. What I really like about the book, Fred, is that you've included further readings in the back of the book for us librarians. We're very happy to see that kind of thing, and we have a lot of those books at our library here in Cincinnati if anybody's interested in that. But I want to thank you both very much for being part of today's discussion, and thank you so much for doing the book and the CD, because I think it's a story that needs to be told much more often around here in Cincinnati and in Dayton and Middletown and Hamilton. And we all should be very, very proud of all that heritage. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks, Brian. It was fun.